are you all doing? And welcome to our Unit 2. This is the final topic that we are going to include before you guys will take the midterm exam. So let's start first. What are the different subtopics that you will be learning in this unit? The title of Unit 2, we do have Literary Poetry Stylistics. So we'll take a look at into poetic forms and genres. We'll also look into a survey of poetry authors and we'll discuss their unique styles. We'll explore the language of poetry. And for the lesson 4, which is I believe you already have a background, we'll look into rhythm, meter, and beat. So this one is very much about the poetry because of course that is the focus of Unit 2. We'll also take a look at all the types of feet, which will be discussed in unit lesson 5. Lesson 6 will be all about poetic techniques. And finally, we'll take a look at into stylistic analysis of poetry using foregrounding theory of Geoffrey Leach. So without further ado, let's start to unveil now lessons 1, 2, and 3. Okay. So let's start with poetic forms and genre. So of course we all know that literary genre, it is the various forms of literature. And in genre, which is similar with literary genre, form of literature as well as any art form, genre here it's similar with literary genre, but if we are going to take a look at genre, definitely takes a broader scope. Okay, because literary genre, it's very specific that it's the genre of literature. But if we are going to talk about genre alone, it can not only be about literature, but any other art form as well. So these forms can actually be categorized into two major types, and the two major types of literary genre are the following. We have the prose and the verse. And you know prose versus verse, right? If it is a prose, we know how it should be presented like a piece or a certain write-up. Of course, it should be in a sentence or in a sentence form, while verse, just think about poetry. So prose, it uses a language form, which we definitely use in our daily life, and sentences are used after sentences. So for example, when we read a short story, of course, that is an example of a prose. It is using sentences. And we'll take a look at the verse form. The verse form class, it is actually known as the poetry. And we all know that there are lines and not sentences. Okay, but we use a poet's lines or the poetic lines written by the poets, of course. And below these lines are grouped into stanza. And it could be in just a form of a phrase, even a word. So it is really not presented in a sentence. So that's how it differs with a prose. So the verse form, we know it's the poetry. Next, the genre. It is a class or a category of text. We do have here another definition of the word genre. Genre, it is a class or category of text with similarities, okay, in these three: form, style, or the subject matter. So in literature, we do have 4 major genres, and that include our poetry, we have our drama, nonfiction, and fiction. So I believe you know poetry, you also know drama, and you definitely know nonfiction, and you also know fiction. Whereas if we are going to take a look at into poetry, since this is the focus of our discussion in Unit 2, poetry class, it is further subdivided into different genres. And we do have here the epic, the lyric, the narrative, satirical, or the prose poetry. So the poetic genre, it is generally a tradition or classification of poetry which is based on the subject matter, style, or other broader literary characteristics. If we are going to take a look at poetry, it is very vast, and also it could be presented in different ways. That's why we do have different types of poems. Some poets would present their poems in a free verse, meaning no rhyme, and some would also present it through like a sonnet, or others are very structural or structured, such as the haiku. They really follow a certain number of syllables when creating a haiku, or a certain number of lines in other forms or types of poems. Okay, wait for a while. Okay, so as you notice, this time we are still trying to define terminologies here. So the next term that we are going to take a look at is the narrative poetry. So a narrative poetry, it is a genre of poetry and it tells a story, and maybe the oldest type of poetry actually. So though it tells a story, but it is also a poem. And we are going to take a look at it. Includes story elements. We do have here some characters, the setting, the plot with action, conflict resolution, and dialogue. Perhaps if we could take a look at no, narrative poetry, like the epics for sure, it would be a great example also of this narrative poetry, knowing that it has these story elements that we are going to consider. So it includes author's thoughts and feelings. And we do have here like the external story and the internal story. And just like any other poetry, narrative poetry uses figurative language. For example, about metaphors. Example of figurative language is the use of metaphors, similes, personification, and even poetic techniques. So we do have a lot of poetic techniques. Like an author is using rhyme, rhythm, the beat, stanzas. So a lot. And these are the things that the author would definitely consider when they try to write a poem. And this narrative poetry, it can also be written, or it can be written from different points of view. It can be written in first person, also third person. And the author's purpose here is to entertain and to leave the reader with a story, that they can remember. So let's try to take a look at this.
The definition of narrative poetry is simply poetry that tells a story. Just like any book you read, narrative poetry also contains characters, as well as a beginning, a middle, and an end. One example of narrative poetry comes from Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. This poem tells The definition of narrative poetry is simply poetry that tells a story. Just like any book you read, narrative poetry also contains characters, as well as a beginning, a middle, and an end. One example of narrative poetry comes from Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. This poem tells the story of a man who is awoken from his sleep to something, or someone, knocking on his door. He then tells us about this raven, who has perched itself above his door and won't leave him alone. The bird slowly begins to drive the man crazy. The details of this story are expressed throughout the poem, and the tension builds during the middle of the poem, ending with the raven continuing to sit above the man's chamber door. Just like in any story we might read, this narrative brings readers through the events of the story with vivid and powerful language. The definition of narrative.
So, as you notice in the video, it is further discussed what narrative poetry is all about, and also it's very good because it gave us an example, a clearer example of a narrative poetry written by Edgar Allan Poe. And as you notice, that poem really definitely shares a story to the readers, and it is a poem, okay? But it is just presented in a narrative. So let's continue. Now we do have here epic poetry. Earlier, I said that the fact that narrative poetry has those story elements, I was able to mention about epic poetry because epic poetry is also a narration of events. Okay, it's also a narration of a story. And in fact, here, an epic poem is a lengthy narrative, but its topic is very specific because it looks into heroic deeds and events, which is definitely significant to a culture or a nation. So, here in epic poetry, we have only a scope, or we have very specific topic that we are going to look into, or that we are going to talk about. So it is a major form of narrative literature, and it is a lengthy type of narrative, and it concerns events of heroic or important nature to the culture of the time. So we have here conventions of epic poetry. So always remember, an epic poem has these following characteristics: a hero who embodies national, cultural, or religious ideals. So, if you could remember, we do have Biag Nilamang in the Philippines, while Beowulf is also an example of an epic poetry, and a lot more examples also of epic poetry that we may be able to remember later on as we go along with our discussion. A hero upon whose actions depends the fate of his people, and it is a course of action in which the hero performs great and difficult deeds, a recognition of or intercession by divine or supernatural powers, a concern with eternal human problems, a dignified and elaborate poetic style. Okay, so after the epic poetry, we have with us our dramatic poetry. So a drama written in verse to be spoken or sung and appears in varying, sometimes related forms in many cultures. So sometimes if we are going to take a look at here, the different types of poetry, they kind of actually overlap in a sense. For example, we have narrative poetry, which is a little bit of a not so specific type of poetry. So now we go with the dramatic poetry. So it's a written verse, and it can either be spoken or sung, and it appears in varying, sometimes related forms that has something to do with a culture. So dramatic poetry is defined as elements that closely relate it to drama, either because it is written in some kind of dramatic form or uses a dramatic technique. So just remember, the dramatic poetry is using some kind of dramatic form, and if you are familiar with a dramatic technique, then you can definitely take a look at it in dramatic poetry. May also suggest a story, but there is more emphasis on character rather than on the narrative. So in the dramatic poetry, it is giving more spotlight on the character compared to the narrative. And we have satirical poetry. So poetry actually can be a powerful vehicle for satire. Okay, so for example, the Romans had a strong tradition of satirical poetry, and oftentimes, not only in Romance but even here in the Philippines, it is written for political purposes, and even for social or some kind of other issues or purpose as well. So the punch of an insult delivered in verse can be many times more powerful and memorable than that of the same insult, spoken or written in prose. So, of course, when we see a satire, it's not, you know, the meaning probably is kind of ironic, or there's a hidden implication on what the person said. Okay, and oftentimes, of course, it is an insult. Okay, the Romans had a strong tradition of satirical poetry, often written for political purposes, and a notable example is the Roman poet Juvenal's satires, whose insults stung the entire spectrum of society. So, actually, a satire is um, way of trying to give a comment or to give an opinion, perhaps, about something. Okay, for example, there is a certain politician that just delivered a speech, so you kind of don't like, of course, like you 100% disagree on what the politician said. So what you will do is you can create a satire on that. Okay, so a notable example is the Roman poet, of course, Juvenal's satires. Now let's try to take a look at on light poetry or light verse. So poetry that attempts to be humorous. So if there is a poetry that aims to insult, there is also a poetry that just want to express some light moments to the reader. So usually brief. It can be a frivolous or serious subjects. Puns is here. Okay, puns is included in this kind of poetry. So it features wordplay, including puns, adventurous rhyme, and heavy alliteration. So I believe you know about puns. Okay, so it's the play of words. For example, I believe if you are fond of using Instagram and you are following Loving Poe, then you could see that she is fond of creating, puns. Okay, so you can also do a search on the example of puns, so you will be guided and you will have an idea on what we're talking about, since this is obviously an example of light poetry. So somehow, if you are kind of feeling down, you can actually use this light poetry to at least give you something like um, would allow you to feel better, feel just very light. So we have here, for example, of an example of a pun. So we have here, for example, the two pianists had a good marriage. They always were in accord. Okay, so it's a play of words, and it is meant to be humorous. So I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. So light poetry, okay, light verse. Next is lyric poetry. This one is also very famous. In fact, we love this kind of poetry. A genre that, unlike epic and dramatic poetry, does not attempt to tell a story, but instead is of a more personal nature, shorter, very important, melodic, and contemplative. So it portrays the poet's own feelings, states of mind, and perception. So generally, it is short, and actually it's very personal, lyric poetry, and it definitely is meant to be sung or accompanied by music. So that is actually the purpose of a lyric poetry. May be sung, yeah, but it's actually meant to be sung. Lyrics often have a refrain or a line or lines that are repeated throughout the poem. Okay, just imagine a song. Songs are examples of lyric poetry. Let's have here another video.
Let's move on to lyric poetry. A lyric poem is a poem that focuses on the thoughts or feelings of a single speaker. Because lyric poems focus on the feelings of a single speaker, oftentimes these types of poems are about love. But lyric poems could actually be about anything that stirs up emotion. Just like this lyric poem by Emily Dickinson, that expresses the emotions of a person who thinks she is going insane. Let's take a look at these last lines. A drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. These several lines describe the emotions and feelings of the speaker who can't seem to quiet the noise inside her head. We as readers get an inside look into these feelings, making this a lyric poem.
Okay, so I hope you understand already what lyric poetry is all about, and in daily basis we definitely is listening to a bunch of lyric poetry. Okay, your favorite Paubaya by Moira. Of course, it is an example of a lyric poetry. Okay, next is let's have the elegy. So an elegy, it is a mournful, melancholy or plaintive poem, and especially a lament for the dead or a funeral song. Originally denoted a type of poetic meter and commonly describes a poem of mourning. So obviously elegy is only used during vigil, we can hear this, and of course when somebody lost someone. Okay, so let's try to take a look at here a video on elegy. Okay, so that's it for the video on elegy. And we know that elegy, it is to express feelings and not to narrate something. So, of course, when you write an elegy, obviously your heart is really full. Okay, full of sad emotions, full of pain, because of course you lost someone. And you dedicate this poem to him or her, then that is an example of an elegy.
Elegy. In English literature, an elegy is a poem of serious reflection, typically a lament for the dead. The Greek term elegeia originally referred to any verse written in elegiac couplets and covering a wide range of subject matter: death, love, war. The term also included epitaphs, sad and mournful songs, and commemorative verses. The Latin elegy of ancient Roman literature was most often erotic and mythological in nature. Because of its structural potential for rhetorical effects, the elegiac couplet was also used by both Greek and Roman poets for witty, humorous, and satiric subject matter. Other than epitaphs, examples of ancient elegy as a poem of mourning include Catullus's Carmen 101 on his dead brother, and elegies by Propertius on his dead mistress Cynthia and a matriarch of the prominent Cornelian family. Ovid wrote elegies bemoaning his exile, which he likened to a death. In English literature, the more modern and restricted meaning of a lament for a departed beloved, a tragic event, has been current only since the 16th century. The broader concept was still employed by John Donne for his elegies, written in the early 17th century. This looser concept is especially evident in the Old English Exeter book, circa 1000 CE, which contains serious meditative and well-known poems such as The Wanderer, The Seafarer, and The Wife's Lament. In these elegies, the narrators use the lyrical I to describe their own personal and mournful experiences. They tell the story of the individual rather than the collective lore of his or her people, as epic poetry seeks to tell. For Samuel Taylor Coleridge and others, the term had come to mean serious meditative poem. Elegy is a form of poetry natural to the reflective mind. It may treat of any subject, but it must treat of no subject for itself, but always and exclusively with reference to the poet. As he will feel regret for the past, a desire for the future, so sorrow and love became the principal themes of the elegy. Elegy presents everything as lost and gone or absent and future. A famous example of elegy is Thomas Gray's Elegy, written in a country churchyard, 1750. In French, perhaps the most famous elegy is Le Lac, 1820, by Alphonse de Lamartine. Elegy may denote a type of musical work, usually of a sad or somber nature. A well-known example is the Elegy, Opus 10, by Jules Massenet. This was originally written for piano as a student work, then he set it as a song, and finally it appeared as the Invocation for cello and orchestra, a section of its incidental music to Le Conte de Lisle's Les Erreurs.
Okay, so I believe you have enough information already about what elegy. So one of the famous example which is included in this video is we do have the Elegy written in a country churchyard by Thomas Gray. You can also check it. Definitely it has you know, a lot. You can just see this poem in the internet, so you can check.
Elegy.
Okay, next is we do have the first fable. So the first fable, it is an ancient literary genre and it is set in verse. A succinct story told in verse that illustrates actually a moral. It also features anthropomorphized animals, you know, plants, objects, or forces of nature that illustrate a moral lesson. So what is the focus of this verse fable is, of course, its focus is to be able to illustrate a moral, okay, from the poem, of course, for the readers as well. Next, we have the prose poetry. Prose poetry is unusual because its form deviates from the nature of poetry, which is writing in verse. So a hybrid genre that shows attribute of both prose and poetry. So let's try to take a look at here, the introduction to prose poetry video.
Have you ever encountered something that claims to be a poem but looks like prose? For instance, maybe it reads like a lyrical poem, but it's written in paragraph form. If so, you might have come across a prose poem. A prose poem, also known as prose poetry, is an example of a hybrid genre of writing. Prose poems occur when someone writes prose using poetry techniques. Before we can understand what prose poems are, it's important to understand the genres of prose and poetry independently. Prose is anything written down that does not possess any poetic meter. Well, that's an easy enough definition, but what is meter exactly? Poetic meter is the rhythm of a poem. Whether you've heard any of Shakespeare's famous sonnets or the latest hip-hop song burning up the charts, chances are that you've noticed that many poems or songs have a certain rhythm to them. This rhythm is based on different factors, including the syllables per line and what syllables are naturally emphasized or stressed if someone were to read the poem out loud. There is more to poetry than poetic meter, of course. Poems are often image-driven and emphasize visual descriptions, including metaphors, while prose tends to focus on aspects such as narrative, characters, and plot arc. In addition, poems also play with the sound of language using repetition and rhyming. To rephrase that, prose contains narrative and does not follow any set rhythm, while poetry is rhythmic and image-based. So what is prose poetry then? It's quite simple. Prose poetry is anything that combines these elements into a single piece of writing. If you want a stricter definition, prose poetry is poetry that is not written in verse and contains other poetic attributes such as rhythm and metaphors.
Alright, that's all for our prose poetry. I believe it's clear now after you guys watched the short video clip. Okay, so um, this prose poetry, this is actually originated in the 19th century France, and its practitioners, it included Aloysius Bertrand, Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud, and Stéphane Mallarmé. Okay, written in prose instead of using verse, but preserving poetic qualities such as heightened imagery, paradoxes, and emotional effects. So it was mentioned in the video what is the difference, why it is called prose poetry. So a famous example also of prose poetry is we have the one written by Dylan Thomas, Under Milkwood. Okay, you can also search it if you like, but if you understand already the definition of what prose poetry is, then we may continue. We also have here the speculative poetry. So it is known as fantastic poetry. It's a poetic genre that deals thematically with the subject, which are kind of beyond reality. So it's something very superficial. So that's why it is called the speculative poetry. Whether via extrapolation as in science fiction or via weird and horrific themes as in horror fiction. So Edgar Allan Poe here is the father of speculative poetry. Now remember, Edgar Allan Poe is also writing prose like short stories, but he's also into creating poems, and in fact he is known with the speculative poetry. So next,
the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Psalm 23, much like the other Psalms and Song of Solomon in the Bible, is among the first known examples of free verse poetry. But what makes free verse poetry different from other poetic forms? Free verse is a category of poetry based on unrhymed lines and a lack of regular meter. So while Psalm 23 might not have the sing-song rhyme and rhythm of other poems you've read, it's still poetry. You might be wondering, if free verse doesn't have a rhyme or a meter, how is it different from prose or ordinary written or spoken word? To begin, free verse does follow conventional poetry in that it has intentional line breaks. The lines, which are often irregular and very short, at the very least give free verse poems the look of poetry. As you can see in Psalm 23, the line breaks where the reader needs to pause, enhancing the overall reading of the verse. These poems also rely on devices that set them apart from everyday language, including parallelism, using similar grammatical constructions and repetition of sounds and images. So while free verse may use some of the same conversational cadences found in prose, it is poetry because of its line breaks and its use of other poetic devices.
alright, so that is what free verse is all about, and in fact, maybe if I am going to, ask you to create a poetry, a lot of you would prefer the free verse because of course we are not really bounded with rhythm, with rhyme here and rhythm. So all we need to do is definitely to express. Okay, next is we have here the haiku poetry. Haiku, it's not unfamiliar to you. It's very familiar to us all, and it is a Japanese written verse, which is, of course, written in 3 lines. We have the 5-7-5, so 5 syllables. Line 2 has 7, and line 3 has 5. So all in all, it is 5-7-5. So all in all, how many lines? Of course, 17. Next, haiku is a mood poem, but it doesn't typically use any metaphors or similes. So often represented by the juxtaposition of two images or ideas and a kirichi, cutting word between them, kind of verbal punctuation which signals the moment of separation and colors the manner in which the juxtaposed elements are related. So, haiku poetry class often include topics on nature, season, time, or period by subtle means. Okay, let's try to take a look at a video. Okay, so just don't forget this reminder that a haiku does not rhyme. It definitely has 3 lines of 575, and it follows the syllable pattern with the 575 and have 3 lines. Okay, yeah. So we also have another type of poetry, and it is the Tonka poetry. So Tonka poetry meaning it's a short poem. And just like haiku, it also originates in Japan. It's a modern Japanese poem or waka. It consists of 5 units, often treated as separate lines were romanized or translated, usually with the following patterns of 5-7, 5-7-7. So this pattern is, we consider the pattern here, which is our syllables, okay? So 5-7, 5-7-7. It offers the struggling haiku writer a bit more flexibility.
You may be familiar with haiku, a traditional style of Japanese poetry containing only 3 lines. It's quite a well-known poetic genre in the Japanese tradition, but there are other important forms as well. Tonka is a traditional form of Japanese poetry quite similar to haiku, but with a few important differences. In this lesson, you'll learn how they are structured and what you might expect to find in a Tonka poem. Let's start by looking at a Tonka poem. This one is by Ono no Komachi from about the year 850. The color of the cherry blossom has faded in vain in the long rain, while in idle thoughts I have spent my life. Tonka poems follow a 5-line form. When written in Japanese, the form will follow a pattern of syllables 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. In other words, there are 5 syllables in the first and third line, and 7 syllables in lines 2, 4, and 5. When Tonka are translated into English, the syllable count usually changes, which is why our example has 9 syllables in the first line. There are only 5 in the original Japanese version of that line.
Okay, so I hope Tonka poetry is clear. Same with haiku, it has a pattern, and for Tonka we have 5, 7, 5, 7, 7.
You may be familiar with haiku, a traditional style of Japanese.
Okay, so I think this is it for now for our first video lecture of Unit 2. So I will see you, or I will talk with you all for the next video lecture. Don't forget to watch this because this will be included as coverage in our midterm exam. Thank you all. I'll see you then. Bye everyone.